Well, when my dad was my age, he and my mom would often have conversations with each other that went something like this. Mom, did you get the stamps at the post office? Dad, no, I didn't know that we needed any. Mom, I told you this morning that we needed stamps. Dad, oops, I guess I forgot. My dad's hearing was in decline. And for years, Mom would joke that it really wasn't, that he just had selective hearing, that he listened to what he wanted to. And now in my middle age, I think Rebecca and I have had some similar conversations to this one that I just remembered from my parents. Sometimes, often with age, our sense of hearing does start to diminish, and sometimes we just have selective listening, and we choose not to listen. Today's passage comes in a time described when the word of the Lord and visions were rare. And maybe this sounds a bit like our time today, too. Maybe you've wondered why God doesn't talk to us anymore like God did during the times of the Bible. Or why we don't witness the same miracles that people did in those stories in the Bible. And maybe these things are rare today, or maybe we're just not paying attention. Maybe we're not listening. Right now, we all need to be better at listening. This past week, with our presidential election and the counting and the long time that has taken, there's been a lot of tension, and this is nothing new. We all know our country has been divided along political lines for some time. But there's tension about how this is going to turn out, wondering if one side is cheated or if one side will take advantage of the system in some way. We're divided. And why is that? Why are we so polarized? Why is it that even families are divided? That longtime friends are now not speaking to one another? I wonder if some of it might have to do with us not listening. I may be wrong, but I feel that if we were to listen to one another more, we would find more of what we had in common rather than what we do not. If we would only stop and listen. I was reminded this past week that during the early 1980s, Tip O'Neill and President Ronald Reagan were friends. Good friends. Politically, these leaders were almost opposites, but they were friends. They got together for breakfast every week. They knew each other's families and listened to each other as people, despite their differences. I don't know when all of that changed. I've read, though, that many of our state's senators and representatives who used to primarily live in Washington, D.C., now primarily live in their home states, which is great for us. But when they lived in D.C., their kids would go to school there. They would be involved in the community outside of politics. Their spouses would get to know one another. They knew each other as people and not just as politicians. And as a result, I can't help but wonder if they were able to listen better to one another. Wouldn't it be great if our leaders, regardless of their political affiliation, would say to one another and to their constituents, as Samuel says to God in today's passage, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel was raised in a temple. He was probably around 10 years old when the events of today's passage took place, and Eli, the priest, was not Samuel's father, but Samuel lived under Eli training to be a priest. He was an apprentice, but already there were some contrasts between him and his master. Eli was senior in his years. Samuel was a youth. Eli was blind, maybe in more ways than one, and Samuel was seeing visions. In the passage, Eli is only ever in his room, and Samuel resides in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred chest which contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Already Samuel was different. Samuel was being raised to be a priest, and someone, that meant he was someone in his tradition and time who taught and oversaw temple rituals. But God had a different plan for Samuel. God would call him to be a prophet, to proclaim God's word to Israel. God's call to Samuel came when he was only a boy, not even a teenager. And if we think that God can only use adults, well, today's passage is a good reminder for us that God can and does call people of all ages and all abilities to be God's hands and feet and voice for the world. We all have various callings in our lives, different roles God calls us to live, from starting in our birth as a child to maybe being a sibling or a parent or a student or a grandparent, a spouse. Along the way, beyond family relations, sometimes we're fortunate when our passions overlap with our vocations. When I was Samuel's age, I wanted to be an FBI agent. And I got some training on that. I watched some TV shows, learned maybe one thing or two, but not much. As a teenager, I wanted to be an architect, and I even was able to take a couple architecture classes in high school. I've been fortunate to have work and passion overlap in some of my adult work, some of my adult life when I served previously in outdoor ministry and now as a pastor. Maybe God is calling you to be a pastor, or maybe someone that you know. The church needs more people to serve congregations, people who have a heart for others, who enjoy a variety of responsibilities. Every day is different, and some days you just don't know what to expect. People who've experienced God's grace and who want to share that grace with others. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. Or maybe you are fortunate enough to know that in your work, in your relationships, or even in your hobbies, God has called you to uniquely serve others for God's good purposes. Or maybe you wrestle with call, with what to do with your life, whether you feel that you're too young or too old, or just haven't found that special something yet. That's okay. Because when that wrestling comes, and it does sooner or later for all of us, we can say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." It's hard to do that. There's so many distractions around us, so many other noises, so many other voices, so much anxiety, so many expectations from others and from ourselves. It can be hard to shut all those out and to listen. And when you do listen, when you do hear God's voice talking to you, maybe directly to you, or maybe through another person, like Samuel, you might find God's words for you to be challenging. God told Samuel that Eli's family would be punished because Eli's sons had abused their priestly authority, and Eli had known about this and hadn't done anything. I can only imagine how difficult that message of God's punishment was for Samuel to deliver to his master. But he did. He shared this as first message from God and would continue to share God's words with the people of Israel. Sometimes those would be words of rebuke. Sometimes they would be words of challenge. Sometimes they would be words of comfort, words of hope. What words does God have for you today? What words does God have for us as God's church today? May we all open our ears, shut out those other noises, those other distractions, so that we might say together, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening."